I'm Susannah Cornwall. I'm Advanced Research Fellow in Theology and Religion at the University of Exeter.
Why did you agree to contribute to Sexuality, the Inclusive Church Resource?
I was really pleased to be invited to contribute to this book, partly because it was Inclusive Church who had asked, and Inclusive Church does such a lot of great work on faith and justice issues. I was pleased in particular that they have been working with Darton, Longman and Todd to make such an accessible and affordable series of books for churches. As an academic, a lot of the stuff that I do ends up in journals behind publishers' paywalls or in books that are far too expensive really to afford. So I'm very pleased about this series for that reason. I was really glad that the books are taking people's experience seriously. Experience is a revelation of God, one of the ways that we know God and know of God. Sometimes, though, it gets left out of theological talk on sexuality, as with other issues, so I was glad that wasn't happening here. I've also been glad, sort of more specifically, to have an opportunity to suggest that a lot of the things that get said and done in churches that purport to be about sexuality are actually about homosexuality more narrowly. And I've wanted to suggest that that's a loss, and that perhaps in doing that we sometimes miss some of the broader theologies of sexuality that already exist.
Can you say more about that? Why do you think there has tended to be a focus on homosexuality in church statements?
I think part of the reason is there's sometimes been a construction of gay people as other, or an assumption that all the people within the church or all the people doing theology are heterosexual. Obviously we know that's not the case, and the church is full of heterosexual and homosexual and bisexual people and so on. But I think sometimes the sense has been that the church is talking about gay people, kind of doing theology for someone else. But I don't think it's just a church problem. I think that as a society in general, we're often not that good at examining or reflecting on things which we just take for granted, which just kind of seem normal and not worth reflecting on. Heterosexuality is often unmarked, just kind of like something in the water that people barely notice or comment on because they do take it for granted. And what I've wanted to suggest in the chapter is that sexuality isn't just to do with orientation, it's broader than that, but that even sexual orientations which don't necessarily get much in the way of theological reflection, like heterosexuality, could benefit from it.
So how do you do that in what you've written?
Well, I suggest that Christian reflection on sexuality shouldn't be all about sexual ethics. Ethics are important, but I've suggested that as Christians we shouldn't just think about what specific behaviour does and doesn't promote flourishing, but also about what it means to be a sexual being in relation to God and in relation to other people in the first place. Christians have thought about a range of sources of revelation about God, including the Bible, including experience, but one of those is also the historical theological tradition, the people who've come before us and done theology before us. And I've suggested that being faithful to that tradition, which is another kind of inclusiveness, means taking that tradition seriously, taking seriously what other Christians before us said and did and believed about sexuality. And that taking seriously means a few things. So it means acknowledging that the tradition has contained a range of voices on sexuality as on other things, and hasn't been univocal. It means treating people who have kind of been our forebears in the tradition as part of the ongoing conversation, and that might sometimes mean holding them accountable. So it means treating those sort of before us in the tradition as part of the ongoing conversation. It also means acknowledging that God is part of this conversation as well, and that our tradition isn't static, it's a dynamic and unfolding tradition, and there will be continued promptings of the Holy Spirit.
So your chapter is called Inclusive Sexuality. What did you mean by that?
Well, Inclusive Church's mission is to work towards welcome and inclusion of everyone in church congregations, and I've suggested that theologies of sexuality are part of that, but that theologies of sexuality need to be inclusive in other ways too. They need to include different voices, including voices from across the historical tradition. As I said a minute ago, they need to include God, which means, I think, acknowledging the spiritual as well as cultural and physical and emotional dimensions of sexuality. It's also, though, about an acknowledgement that although sexuality involves people who are participating in sex together, it's never just about them. It's always got broader implications for their community, which might be their immediate family and friends, but is also going to have social, political, broader economic connotations and implications as well.